Tonight, our attention turns to Kyiv, where Ukraine's leadership has issued one of its most sobering assessments yet of the country's needs for survival. Speaking at the annual Yalta European Strategy conference, Defense Minister Denys Shmyhal declared that Ukraine will require more than 100 billion euros, at least 120 billion US dollars, to sustain its defense in 2026 if the Russian war continues. The announcement was both a financial forecast and a political alarm. Shmyhal emphasized that even in the event of a ceasefire or a negotiated pause, the costs of maintaining Ukraine's armed forces in fighting shape would remain staggering. As he put it, this is not just a question of weapons or soldiers, but of the economy of war. In his own words, the minister did not mince language. I must say that if the war continues, we will need a minimum of $120 billion for next year. If the war stops, we will not need such a lower amount just to fulfill our obligations, just to keep our army in good shape in case of secondary aggression from Russia. So in any case, we are talking about money, about the economy of war. The bluntness of that statement reflected Ukraine's reality. 3.5 years into Russia's full-scale invasion, the country has reached a point where military endurance depends as much on financial lifelines as on battlefield strategy. In simple terms, to outlast Moscow, Kyiv must not only match Russia's firepower, but also its spending power. Shmyhal elaborated further, warning that spending less than Russia would not save money, but instead cost land, sovereignty, and human lives. He explained, the economy of war shows that if we spend less money than Russia, then we start paying with our territories and, most importantly, with our lives. So we must collect all the necessary resources, all the necessary money. We understand that after 3.5 years, many taxpayers are exhausted, tired of spending so much money. That's why I fully support the idea expressed by Roxolana, the confiscation of Russian assets. These words carried a dual message. One aimed at Ukrainians weary of sacrifice, and another aimed at international allies, some of whom are showing signs of fatigue. Western taxpayers are increasingly skeptical about funding Ukraine's defense, particularly in the United States and Europe, where political debates over aid packages have become bitterly divisive. Yet the alternative, Shmyhal implied, is worse. A Ukraine that cannot keep pace financially risks collapsing militarily. For Kyiv, this is not a choice between comfort and hardship. It is a choice between existence and defeat. The scale of Ukraine's projected needs is staggering. To put it into perspective, 100 billion euros surpasses Ukraine's entire pre-war annual GDP. It is a sum the country cannot raise internally, especially when its economy remains battered by missile strikes, blockaded exports, and the loss of occupied territories. That is why international assistance is not simply desirable, it is indispensable. But how to secure such sums when Western treasuries are under strain? Here, Shmyhal pointed to a controversial but increasingly discussed option, the confiscation of frozen Russian assets. More than $300 billion belonging to the Russian state remain immobilized abroad, largely in Western financial institutions. Unlocking these reserves, Shmyhal argued, would not only provide Ukraine with the funds it desperately needs, but would also strike a powerful blow against Moscow, making the aggressor pay for the destruction it has caused. The idea resonates with many in Ukraine and among some allies, yet it is fraught with legal and political obstacles. Governments worry about setting precedents that could undermine international financial stability. What happens if future conflicts lead to other states' assets being seized? Could this weaken trust in the global financial system? These debates make the path forward uncertain. Nevertheless, for Ukraine, time is running short. Peace talks, once led by Washington, have long since collapsed. The front lines remain active, and Russia shows no sign of ending its offensive. In such a climate, planning for 2026 is not a luxury but a necessity. Kyiv must prepare for the possibility that war will continue into a fifth year and beyond. At the Yalta European Strategy conference, the atmosphere reflected this urgency. Delegates, diplomats and policymakers gathered in Kyiv listened intently as Shmyhal laid out the stark numbers. The conference, often a stage for broader debates about Europe's future, this year became a forum for confronting an immediate and brutal reality. Without sustained international funding, Ukraine risks being ground down by Russia's sheer economic weight. Shmyhal's framing of the conflict as an economy of war resonated throughout the hall. It was a reminder that modern wars are not fought by armies alone. They are waged by treasuries, parliaments and taxpayers. Missiles may be launched on the battlefield, but the resources that build them are secured in budget negotiations and economic policy rooms. He acknowledged candidly the fatigue that grips many Western nations. Inflation, rising energy costs, and the lingering social toll of the pandemic have left voters frustrated. In such an environment, calls to allocate billions more to Ukraine can feel politically toxic. But Shmyhal insisted that allowing Russia to gain the upper hand by outspending Ukraine would carry a far higher cost, not just for Kyiv, but for Europe and the global order. He argued that Ukraine's defence is not merely a national cause, but a continental one. The country stands as the shield on NATO's eastern edge, absorbing the brunt of Russia's aggression. If Ukraine fails, the threat will not end at its borders. The Baltic states, Poland, and potentially beyond could be next. By framing the issue in this way, Shmyhal placed responsibility on the international community. Will democracies endure in their support, or will they allow fatigue and political squabbles to deliver Moscow a victory it has not earned on the battlefield? The stakes are stark. Each euro or dollar not committed, he implied, could translate into territory lost, families displaced, and lives cut short. And so the conference became less about long-term visions of European integration and more about the immediate price of survival. As applause echoed through the hall, it was tempered by an awareness of the challenge ahead. Securing more than 100 billion euros will require extraordinary coordination between allies, new financial mechanisms, and possibly a landmark legal move to seize Russian state assets. Each of these paths carries risks, but inaction, Ukraine warns, carries the greatest risk of all. For the Ukrainian people, the numbers on Shmyhal's ledger are not abstract. They represent weapons to defend homes, salaries for soldiers, fuel for vehicles, and the rebuilding of shattered infrastructure. They are, in effect, the currency of survival. The Yalta European Strategy conference closed with no easy answers, but Shmyhal's message will reverberate far beyond Kyiv. The world is now confronted with a choice: to step up and sustain Ukraine's defense, or to risk watching Europe's security unravel, one unpaid invoice at a time. And so as 2026 approaches, the question is not whether Ukraine needs the money. The question is whether the world will provide it, and in doing so, whether democracies can prove they have the endurance to outlast a determined autocracy.
I should say that if the war will continue, we will need, as a minimum, 120 billions of dollars for the next year. If the war will stop, we will need not so much less amount just to fulfill our storages, just to keep our army in the good form in case of secondary aggression from Russian side. So in any way, we are speaking about money, about economy of war. Economy of war demonstrates that if we spend less money than Russia, then we begin pay by our territories, and most important, by our lives. So we need to fundraise all needed sources, all needed money. We understand that after 3.5 years, many taxpayers are exhausted, are tired by spending such a huge amounts of money. So because of this, I support fully idea of which Roxolana sounds, it's confiscation of Russian assets. Maybe not